Inside Constantinople, Constantine and his advisors knew the assault was coming. Intelligence from scouts and from the sounds of the Ottoman camp made it clear. The emperor summoned his commanders and gave what would be his final speech. He asked them to be brave, to remember that they were the heirs of Rome, to defend their faith and their families. He walked through the streets of the city, now eerily quiet. The population had retreated into the churches to pray. The great church of Hagia Sophia, which had been the site of such bitter controversy over the union with Rome, was filled that night with both Orthodox and Catholic Christians praying together, united at last by the nearness of death. The Patriarch of Constantinople served the liturgy. Constantine himself received communion. It was, by any reckoning, one of the most moving scenes in the entire history of medieval Christendom, a final moment of unity and grace before catastrophe. Constantine then rode back to the walls. He took his position at the Blocherny section with his closest companions. Whatever he felt privately, fear, sorrow, resignation, perhaps even a strange liberation, he showed nothing but steady resolve to those around him. He was 48 or 49 years old. He had been emperor for 4 years. He had never had children. He had outlived 2 wives. He had spent his entire reign trying to save a civilization that was already beyond saving. But he had never stopped trying. Across the walls, the Ottoman camp came alive in the darkness. Mehmed made his final dispositions. He deployed his forces in 3 successive waves. The first wave consisted of the irregular troops, the Bashi Bazouks, poorly armed auxiliaries from various backgrounds, whose function was partly to exhaust and distract the defenders and partly expendable. Behind them were the Anatolian regular troops, better trained and equipped. And in reserve, waiting for the moment when the defenders were exhausted, were the Janissaries, the Sultan's elite professional infantry. The finest soldiers in the Ottoman world, recruited as boys from Christian families across the Balkans, raised in strict military discipline, armed with the best weapons, fiercely loyal and utterly ruthless. Mehmed told his commanders that no one was to show mercy to those who resisted. The city had refused to surrender. The old rules applied. At approximately 1:30 in the morning of May 29, 1453, the Ottoman trumpet sounded, and the greatest assault in medieval European history began. The first wave, the Bashi Bazouks, surged forward toward the walls in darkness, carrying ladders, screaming, beaten forward by their officers. They were met by the Greek and Genoese defenders with arrows, crossbow bolts, cannon fire, and hand weapons. In the confined spaces of the outer ditch and at the base of the walls, the fighting was savage. The Bashi Bazouks suffered enormous casualties. After 2 hours of assault, they were pulled back, having failed to breach the defenses but having done exactly what Mehmed intended, exhausted the defenders. The second wave. The Anatolian troops pressed forward into the same killing ground. They were better armed and more disciplined than the irregulars, and they pushed harder. At several points they reached the walls and attempted to scale them. The fighting was brutal and intimate, men stabbing and slashing at close quarters in the darkness and smoke, lit by torches and the muzzle flashes of cannon. Giustiniani moved constantly along his section of the wall, directing the defense with extraordinary energy and skill. The Anatolian troops were also eventually repulsed, but at much greater cost to the defenders. It was now perhaps 4 in the morning. The Janissaries were still waiting. Mehmed himself rode to the edge of the Ottoman lines to watch. By all accounts, he maintained an almost preternatural calm, directing the battle with cool precision. He ordered the cannon to keep firing even as the assault troops advanced, accepting some friendly fire casualties, to maintain pressure on the walls. He ordered his fleet to assault the sea walls from the Golden Horn simultaneously, preventing the defenders from shifting forces. He threw everything he had at the walls in a coordinated, multi-front assault that the depleted defending force could barely contain. Then came the Janissarie, as 12,000 of them advanced in disciplined silence, in tight formation, maintaining their cohesion even under missile fire from the walls. They did not scream like the Bashi Bazouks or charge wildly like the Anatolians. They walked in step until they were close enough. And then they ran, not in a mob, but in formation, covering each other, presenting a wall of shields and spears to the defenders above them. The fighting at the walls stirring. The Janissary assault was the most intense of the entire siege. Giustiniani was everywhere at once, and the Genoese and Greek soldiers under his command performed feats of extraordinary valor. For nearly an hour, even the Janissaries could not break through. And then, sometime in the gray light before dawn, the exact moment and the exact cause are disputed by the historical sources, and perhaps will never be fully resolved, the defense collapsed. Most widely accepted account is that Giovanni Giustiniani was struck by a crossbow bolt or possibly by a small firearm, a wound to his hand or chest. The sources differ, and that he chose to leave the wall to have the wound treated. He asked Constantine to open the gate behind the wall so he could be carried through. Constantine reportedly begged him to stay, but Giustiniani was removed from the wall. Whatever the exact nature of his wound, whether it was genuinely incapacitating or whether in some accounts, fear finally overcame him. His departure was catastrophic for the defense. The Genoese soldiers who had fought so fiercely under his personal leadership saw their commander being carried away. Some followed him. A gap opened in the Genoese section of the defense. The Janissaries, pressing continuously, sensed the faltering and intensified their assault, compounding this crisis. A smaller gate in the Blauschernay wall, the Kerkeporta, a postern gate that had allegedly been left unlocked either by negligence or treachery, had been discovered by a party of Ottoman soldiers. They forced it open and flooded through into the space between the inner and outer walls. The defenders suddenly found Ottoman soldiers behind them. The cry went up in Greek, "The city is taken! The city is taken!" Within minutes, the organized defense disintegrated. Some defenders fled. Others continued to fight in isolated pockets of resistance, with nowhere to go and nothing left to lose. The Janissaries poured over and through the walls, and behind them, the greater Ottoman army followed. Constantine XI, the last Roman emperor, disappeared in the chaos of the final moments. He was last seen, according to the most commonly cited Byzantine sources, throwing off the imperial insignia that marked him as emperor, the purple cloak that would have made him a prized hostage worth capturing alive, and charging into the press of battle on foot with his sword drawn. Whether this is exactly what happened, or whether it is a story shaped by the grief and pride of survivors who needed their emperor to have died heroically rather than simply to have fallen in the confused carnage, we cannot know with certainty. His body was never definitively identified, though the Ottomans later produced a head which Mehmed's court identified as the emperor's, and he was apparently given a burial appropriate to a ruler. Constantine XI Palaiologos died as he had lived, defending the impossible. He was the 93rd and last emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire, heir to a line that stretched back to Augustus Caesar. With his death, the Roman Empire, the oldest continuous political institution in Western history, came to an end after more than 22 centuries of existence. The sack of the city that followed was brutal, as promised. Mehmed had told his troops they could plunder the city for 3 days, as was the customary reward for soldiers who took a city by storm after it had refused to surrender. For hours, Ottoman soldiers moved through the streets of Constantinople, entering houses, churches, monasteries, and palaces, taking whatever they could carry. Citizens were enslaved, thousands of them, ranging from aristocrats to beggars. Churches were stripped of their treasures. The magnificent church of Hagia Sophia, where thousands of terrified civilians had taken refuge, was entered by Ottoman soldiers who proceeded to divide the people inside as slaves, Mehmed, by most accounts, did not enter the city until the initial fury of the sack had somewhat subsided. He rode through the streets on a white horse, surrounded by his commanders. When he reached Hagia Sophia, the great domed cathedral that had been the spiritual heart of Eastern Christendom for nearly 1,000 years, he dismounted and entered on foot. He took a handful of earth and poured it over his head in a gesture of humility before God. He ordered that the church should be converted to a mosque. He prayed there. An imam climbed to the gallery and called the azan, the Muslim call to prayer, echoing through the vast interior that had heard Christian liturgy for 916 years. After 3 days, Mehmed ordered the sack to stop. By his command, survivors who had not been enslaved were permitted to return to their homes. He issued proclamations of toleration to the Greek Orthodox Christians remaining in the city, appointing a new patriarch, Genoese II, and guaranteeing the Orthodox Church's right to continue functioning under Ottoman authority. This was not primarily an act of sentiment but of policy. Mehmed intended to rule a great, multi-ethnic empire and needed the cooperation of his Christian subjects. He would spend the following decades working to repopulate and rebuild the city, which he renamed simply the capital, Istanbul, from the Greek phrase "Eis Polen," meaning into the city or to the city. The fall of Constantinople on May 29, 1453, sent shockwaves through the Christian world that lasted for decades. In Rome, Pope Nicholas V reportedly wept when he heard the news. In Venice and Genoa, merchants calculated the damage to their trade routes. In Hungary, the king prepared his defenses. In France and England, poets and chroniclers lamented the fall of the Second Rome. Across Europe, the event was experienced as a catastrophe almost beyond comprehension, the greatest Christian city in the world. The city of Constantine and Justinian and Basil the Bulgar slayer had fallen to the infidel. The shock was comparable to nothing in living memory, but the meaning of 1453 extended far beyond the immediate grief and outrage. Historians have argued, both then and ever since, that the fall of Constantinople represented the definitive end of the medieval era and the beginning of the early modern period. This is, of course, a somewhat arbitrary historical periodization. History does not actually end at midnight on a given date and begin again at dawn, but it captures something real about the significance of the event. The fall of Constantinople accelerated a process that was already underway. The migration of Greek scholars and intellectuals to Western Europe, particularly to Italy. Byzantine scholars had been arriving in Italy for decades, bringing with them manuscripts of ancient Greek texts, philosophical works, mathematical treatises, works of history and science that Western Europe had largely lost during the centuries after the fall of Rome. After 1453, this flow became a flood. These scholars and the manuscripts they carried helped fuel the Renaissance, the great rebirth of classical learning and artistic achievement that would transform European civilization in the 5th, 10th, and 16th centuries. Fall of Constantinople also disrupted the overland trade routes that had connected Western Europe to China and India through Central Asia and the Middle East, the ancient Silk Road, with the Ottoman Empire now controlling the critical choke points of this trade network. European merchants faced increasing tolls and barriers on the Eastern trade. This commercial pressure would, within a few decades, drive European explorers to look for alternative routes to Asia. Columbus's voyages of 1492 and da Gama's voyage to India by sea in 1498 were not caused solely by the fall of Constantinople, but the event was one of the important forces that pushed Europe toward the Age of Discovery. The Ottoman conquest also established one of the great empires of the early modern world. Under Mehmed II and his successors, the Ottoman Empire would grow to encompass the Middle East, North Africa, Southeastern Europe, and the Caucasus region. At its height in the 16th and 17th centuries, it would be one of the most powerful and sophisticated states in the world, controlling territory from Algeria to Iraq, from Hungary to Yemen. The city of Constantinople, Istanbul, would be its glittering capital, repopulated and rebuilt into one of the greatest cities of the early modern world. Home to over 1 million people by the 17th century, the siege also had lasting consequences for the development of military technology. The success of Mehmed's artillery demonstrated, to every ruler in Europe and the Middle East, that even the most formidable medieval fortifications could be reduced by sufficiently powerful cannon. The era of the great medieval castle and walled city as essentially impregnable defensive positions was over. Across Europe, military engineers began designing new types of fortifications, lower, thicker, with angled bastions designed to deflect cannonballs rather than receive them directly. The Tres Italian, the new style of fortification developed in Italy in the decades after 1453, would reshape the nature of warfare for centuries. It is easy, in a history of such grand scale, to lose sight of the human beings at the center of it. Let us return to them. Giovanni Giustiniani, who had commanded the Genoese defense so brilliantly for weeks, was evacuated to the island of Chios, where he died of his wounds within days of the city's fall. The exact nature of his wound and the question of whether his withdrawal from the wall was courageous or cowardly has been debated by historians ever since. Some Byzantine sources blamed him bitterly for abandoning the defense at the critical moment. Others credited him with having held the walls against impossible odds for nearly 2 months. Both things may be true simultaneously. The Venetian sailors and soldiers who had remained in Constantinople to help defend it, fewer than 200 of them, mostly died in the fighting or were enslaved. A handful escaped on ships through the Sea of Marmara, Laucus Notaras. The senior Byzantine nobleman who had reportedly preferred the Sultan's turban to Rome's cardinal's hat, initially survived the fall of the city and was treated with respect by Mehmed, who was reportedly considering employing him in the new Ottoman administration. Then, according to various accounts, Notaras refused a command from Mehmed that he found degrading or offensive and was executed along with his sons. The story is told differently in different sources, but the outline appears consistent. Even Ottoman pragmatism had its limits. The approximately 50,000 people who had been inside Constantinople at the time of its fall were mostly enslaved, a catastrophic fate that nonetheless allowed many of them to eventually survive and, in some cases, to be ransomed by their families or to purchase their own freedom over the following years. The Greek community in Istanbul, as it now became, would persist and even maintain a significant presence in the city for centuries. Though always in a subordinate position under Ottoman rule, Mehmed II himself continued to wage wars of conquest after 1453 with barely a pause. He conquered Serbia, Bosnia, the Crimea, most of Greece including Athens, and launched campaigns deep into Anatolia and the Balkans. He attempted an invasion of Italy in 1480, capturing the city of Otranto, which appeared to threaten Rome itself. Pope Sixtus IV was reportedly preparing to flee the city before Mehmed's sudden death in 1481 at the age of 49 ended that campaign. He died on his way to another military campaign, still conquering, still restless, still reaching for the world. His epithet, Fatih, the Conqueror, was already fixed before his death. Walk through Istanbul today and you walk through the aftermath of May 29, 1453. The Theodosian walls still stand, partially restored, partially ruined, running across the western end of the old city peninsula, immense, magnificent, and haunted. Stand next to them and look at the scale of the stones, the height of the towers even in their damaged state, and try to imagine what it took to breach them. The Ottoman cannonballs that struck them are still embedded in some sections. Frozen in the moment of their impact 5.5 centuries ago, Hagia Sophia has had the most complex afterlife of any building on Earth. Built as a church in 537 AD, converted to a mosque in 1453, converted to a museum in 1934 by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk as a symbol of Turkey's secular republic, and reconverted to a mosque in 2020, it contains within its extraordinary interior the entire history of Constantinople, Byzantium, and Istanbul. The great Byzantine mosaics, covered during the Ottoman period with plaster to conceal their Christian imagery, peek through in various states of revelation and concealment. The mihrab, indicating the direction of Mecca, sits at a slight angle to the building's axis, because the church was aligned with Jerusalem, not Mecca. The building itself is a physical record of the collision and continuation of civilizations. The question of what 1453 means, of who the heroes and villains were, of whether it was a tragedy or a triumph, of what it tells us about the relationship between Christianity and Islam, between Europe and the Middle East, between conquest and civilization, is not merely a historical question. It remains a live political and cultural question in the 21st century, contested with genuine passion in Turkey, Greece, and across the broader world. For Turks, the conquest represents a moment of national founding glory, the beginning of the Ottoman Empire at its height. For Greeks and for Eastern Orthodox Christians, it remains a wound, the glessa, the fall, a day of mourning observed to this day. For historians of all backgrounds, it is one of those rare events that genuinely changed the direction of world history. The last Roman emperor died fighting at the walls of his city rather than surrendering or fleeing. The last great siege of the medieval world was decided by cannon, the weapon of the modern era. The last Byzantine church was converted to a mosque before the corpses of its defenders had even cooled. And from the wreckage and the transformation, a new world began to emerge. The Ottoman Empire, the Renaissance, the Age of Discovery, the early modern era with all its possibilities and all its conflicts. There is a poignant detail from the final night of Constantinople that has stayed with historians and storytellers for centuries. On the evening of May 28, 1453, the last night before the final assault, the people of Constantinople lit candles and lamps all along the city's walls. Across the water in the Ottoman camp, soldiers watched the lights of the doomed city burning against the darkness, thousands of small flames, illuminating a civilization in its final hours. The Ottoman soldiers reportedly wept, moved by the sight. Even the men who were about to destroy the city recognized, in that moment, that they were witnessing something irreplaceable passing from the world. Civilizations are not mere arrangements of stone and politics. They are repositories of human meaning, of art and language and prayer and memory and love. Constantinople was all of these things, accumulated over more than 1,000 years. When it fell, something genuinely irreplaceable was lost. And yet, from that loss, new things grew. The manuscripts saved by fleeing scholars fertilized the Renaissance. The trade routes severed by Ottoman power pushed European sailors to discover new worlds. The Ottoman Empire itself created centuries of complex, sophisticated civilization. History does not move in straight lines, and what looks like an ending is often, from a different angle, a beginning. On May 29, 1453, an age ended, and another began. The sound of the cannon faded. The smoke cleared from the Bosphorus. The bells of Hagia Sophia rang no more. But the sun rose over Constantinople, as it always had, as it always would. The golden horn glittered in the morning light. The great dome caught the first rays and held them. The city endured, as it still endures, today, transformed, layered, complicated, contested, and magnificent, above the strait where Europe meets Asia, where East meets West, where the old world ended and the new one was born. This was 1453. This was the fall of Constantinople. This was the end of an age. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, please leave a comment, share this video, and subscribe for more deep dives into the moments that shaped our world.